Hello, I am joined by Tom Holmes, and today I'm going to discuss the Chechnya and the Chechen wars. Um, this is probably a more well-known subject than the last one on the Gorn kind of back, but I think a lot of people are quite ignorant on its history and why Chechnya is such a region that's problematic. The Second Chechen War officially ended in 2009, but today it's one of the top recruiting grounds for the Islamic State. Also, there's lots of pogroms against some homosexuals going on in Chechnya at the moment. So it's quite an interesting region. Um, I think I should go briefly over its history, which is quite hectic. But first, I think I'm going to screen share a map of Chechnya. Um, let's see where it's positioned in Russia. In a second.
It's a real question as to whether or not this is more messed up than Nagorno-Karabakh.
It probably is more messed up. See what's going on there.
Hmm.
That presents everyone. Yeah. All right. Right. Here's Chechnya in the North Caucasus. And the Caucasus is a mess in terms of ethnic minorities.
I think somebody once said, as a sort of funny statement, that the Caucasus has as many ethnic groups and languages as it does mountains.
Yes, that's a common reference. I mean, the Chechen language is really a recent creation in the 20th century. Like, Chechnya had hundreds of languages when the Russians conquered the region. In 1858, with Russia to Jew Chechnya, and the Russians referred Chechnya as a Wild East, and that's a reference to America, the Wild West, because it was never banditry. And historically, the North Caucasus region is incredibly mountainous region, and it's very hard to pass through the mountain. Now, on the map, you see the border between Georgia and Russia here, or you can see my cursor, and up here in Dagestan, there's only like two passes you can go into recently.
It's also another thing worth noting that the Caucasus is divided by two regions. The Lesser Caucasus down in the south, which is Armenia, Azerbaijan, those sorts of places, and then the Greater Caucasus, which is Chechnya. The Greater Caucasus was sheltered largely from the empires that conquered the Lesser Caucasus, such as the Persians, the Romans, and the Ottomans. Because of its mountainous regions. It was difficult for those empires to get there, so by and large they didn't bother and just took the Lesser Caucasus as a whole.
Generally, that was the case, but a lot of these minor states. Remember, the North Caucasus is generally basically centralized. There's the Iranian central states other than the Kingdom of Circassia or the old Kingdom in Dagestan. Most of these towns and communities were actually tributary states to either Persian or to a nomadic Khanate in the north, the Caucasus. And that was the case with the Mongols and the Golden Horde. They weren't conquered, but they gave them tribute. Russia started becoming interested in the Caucasus in general because they wanted to gain trade into the Middle East, and this was a policy from Catherine the Great. And how it was into the reign of Peter the First of Russia that the Russians actually tried to conquer Chechnya, and this was a part of a very long war, after decades, to conquer the entire region.
In order to fight off the invading Russian forces, you had a man called Imam Shamil who used Islam and jihad in order to try and unite the Caucasus people. But he specifically, while he was in favor of the Caucasus as a whole, he hated the Chechens because he considered them a bunch of bandits. Ultimately, even though he tried his best, he was unsuccessful in uniting the Caucasus, and so he failed to fight off the Russians.
Yeah. Whereas I think the war that he fought was known as the Caucasian War, which is a war that lasted over 4 decades to end. It was some of the most brutal wars in that period of history. And the only reason it occurred because the Safavid Persians basically gave Dagestan to Russia after the Russo-Persian War at the beginning of the 19th century. Yeah. Also, it resulted in something called the Circassian genocide. The Circassians were a minority in the North Caucasus, and here's the thing about the region. Now the minorities are predominantly Islam, but at this point it wasn't the case. Islam really came to prominence as a unifying religion against the Russians. You had particularly Sunni Islam, because there were more Shia Muslims before the 19th century in the region. And the Circassian genocide led to the almost complete ethnic cleansing of Circassia. Now, you see this, look at the ethnic map here. The Circassians were right at the back, so you need to see the Azov. Now, that area is now also entirely Russian.
Yeah, there was a lot of ethnic cleansing that occurred in these regions during the 19th century by the Russians. Chechnya, their ethnic cleansing came in the 1940s, 50s, when Joseph Stalin came into power. There is a saying in the Caucasus which basically goes along the lines of, it takes a Caucasian to beat a Caucasian. Unfortunately for the Chechens and the people of the Caucasus as a whole, Joseph Stalin was born in Georgia and took over the Soviet Union, as we all know. After World War II ended, the Chechen people were accused by the Soviets of conspiring with the Wehrmacht. Whether they were or not is not particularly known, but either way, it didn't matter to the Soviets. Ethnic cleansing and genocide ensued, and the Chechens were forced out of Chechnya into places like Kazakhstan, and their culture was completely wiped out in favor of a Soviet paradise. This led to the creation of Chechnya's capital, Grozny, which was designed to be a Russian city for Russian people.
Yeah. I should say that it wasn't until the 1980s that Chechens actually formed the majority population in Chechnya. It's actually Khrushchev that allowed Chechens to return and restores the Chechen Autonomous Soviet Socialist Republic.
It was part of his policy of de-Stalinization.
Yeah. And this, in the heart of Chechens, is like the Holocaust to people of Israel, or the Armenian genocide to Armenians. That's what it's like for Chechens. In a way, the Chechen attitude is that we have to do this to survive, and out of fear of being ethnically cleansed, this is part of the Chechen nationalism. Chechnya was also where in 1917, after the collapse of the Tsarist Empire, Chechnya did declare independence and was conquered by the Soviets in 1920.
You also notice here that the Soviets are kind of responsible, in fact, mainly responsible for Chechnya's problem. If you remember back to when we discussed Nagorno-Karabakh a few weeks ago, you'll remember that that was also the fault of the Soviets. By and large, a lot of the problems of the Caucasus are because of the Soviet Union, much like how a lot of the Middle East's problems are because of the British and French empires.
I've got another graph to show you. Now, this is the population, the ethnic population of Chechnya. You can see in the 1940s and 50s, the drop in the population because of Stalin and expelling Chechens. And you can see the rise of the Russian population as it actually settled Russians in the region.
Yeah, this period of time when you see the huge spike in the Russian population was when the ethnic cleansing occurred.
Yeah, so speak about the figures. And I can see the Chechen population is at 1.2 million. It's over that. Now that might be not true. There's lots of allegation that they're lying about the figures of population, and that the population of Chechnya is actually lower. And a lot of people actually fled the region. And this is a recent thing. Chechnya is considered a recruiting ground for ISIS, and a lot of ISIS fighters are actually from Chechnya. There's also a lot of volunteers from Chechnya going to Ukraine and fighting the Russians. And this is another thing that is quite unheard of.
James asks in the comments, is the current climate there stable with the last war being 10 years ago? It's more stable than it was during the Chechen wars, but it's not particularly stable. The only reason why Chechnya remains as stable as it does is because the current president, in reality, he's a dictator, Ramzan Kadyrov, rules the country with an iron fist through his militia. But Chechnya is not a safe place nor a pleasant place to live. If the government doesn't persecute you, the insurgents will persecute you, or the mafia that operate in there will persecute you, either through extorting you through money, or they'll kidnap your family members and hold them for ransom. This is both what the insurgency and the mob bosses do. As for the insurgency as a whole, there is a low-level insurgency still going on in Chechnya, but it's nowhere near as bad as it was during the war. They're no concern for Vladimir Putin as much as they were, because Russia is not as weak as it once was.
Also, what's Chechnya most known on the news is that massive persecution against gay people, and most of that persecution actually comes from Chechnya.
Yeah.
You see the Chechen Republic within Russia create gay pogroms.
Yeah, the reason for this is because Ramzan Kadyrov is a fundamentalist Muslim as well. So he, in order to satisfy the large and very fundamentalist Muslim population of the country, he has to he persecutes the gays.
Yeah. The Chechen War was one of the most brutal wars in the 1990s. It rivaled what we saw in the Balkans. Now, in Gnosy alone, when the Russians tried to retake the city in 1996, they lost more tanks than when the Russians took Berlin.
Yeah, it's worth keeping in mind that the first Chechen war was short, but it was some of the heaviest fighting that Europe had seen since World War II. And as Cameron mentioned, it rivaled what we saw in places like Bosnia and Croatia.
There's also a couple of things that people. One little thing about neighbouring Dagestan, which is another autonomous republic that's got a similar situation. Now, a lot of the arms and a lot of terrorism actually come from Dagestan next door, which is another region very, very similar ethnically and religiously to Chechnya. And often when there's a spark in terrorism in Chechnya, it always falls in Dagestan. The pattern that's it's very seen.
In terms of how the Chechen War started, the first Chechen War began on the 11th of December 1994, and it began when Boris Yeltsin tried to topple the current president of Chechnya, which at the time was Dzhokhar Dudayev. He did it covertly, first of all, by trying to organize a revolution/coup by saying, oh, we've got these militants and this militia and we're going to use them to topple Dudayev. In reality, they were conscript soldiers. The coup failed and Jadayev exposed the conscript soldiers on live TV for the whole world to see. Yeltsin sent him a declaration basically saying, "Stop doing this or we'll invade." Jadayev refused, and so Russia said that they were going to, quote, "restore constitutional order to Chechnya," and that led to the invasion. It was originally anticipated to be a lot quicker and a lot more efficient than it actually ended up being, much like how the Soviets anticipated the Afghanistan war to be over and done with in a very short period of time. However, what they massively underestimated is, one, how mountainous and how hard to hold territory in Chechnya was, and two, how fiercely resistant the Chechen people were. The population in Chechnya at the time was heavily armed. Most people had an AK-47 or some kind of a gun to protect themselves, and they had a history of fierce resistance against the Russians. Many of them were willing to fight and die to keep the Russians out of their territory.
Yeah. The Second War actually started in 1999 when Mashinov announced that he's going to create Islamic Religious War in Chechnya. And what he did, he decided to phase this over 3 years. Now, this indicated to the Russians that they needed to send more troops in, and what happened as a result, there were ended up being clashes between Russian and Chechen troops, and then Chechen troops went into Dagestan in incursions to recruit Dagestan troops in order to create what they called an Islamic State.
That was one of the causes of the second one. The second reasons to why it happened was the Russian apartment bombings that happened in 1999. These were a series of bombings that occurred in cities such as Moscow and Volgodonsk and killed over 100 people, 300 people. Putin, who at the time was prime minister, blamed it all on the Chechens. He used his party's pro-war stance to catapult himself to the presidency, and then when he became president, he stepped up full-scale military invasion in Chechnya. The Russians showed no mercy to the Chechens the second time round. They leveled Grozny completely, flattened the city. In fact, when the Russians took Grozny back in 2000, the UN called the city the most destroyed city on Earth because they hammered it with airstrikes and rocket artillery, and they didn't care who they targeted. In fact, Russia's tactic when it comes to war tends to be indiscriminate bombardment. Civilian, combatant, doesn't matter. They'll kill you either way. In terms of the war itself, there were two phases, much like Iraq. There was the heavy fighting phase, which lasted 2 years, and then there was the insurgency phase that lasted 8 years.
Yeah. Also, was it 2003? Chechen, no, 2000, it was late 2002. Chechen rebels actually went into Moscow and actually put 800 people on the hostage in a Russian theater. And I think about 120 hostages were killed. And to get the Chechens out, the Russians actually pumped in narcotic gas to get the Chechen forces out, and this started a stronger crackdown on Chechen insurrections in Chechnya over the next couple of years. Also, President Kordov was blamed, and he basically was forced out in 2004. And was replaced by Mashikov, which is another anti-Russian leader of Chechnya. And he basically dies in March 2005. He basically got shot by Russian forces.
Yeah.
And then,
there were two main figures in the Second Chechen War that were in charge of the resistance against the Russians. There was Aslan Maskhadov, who was the president of Chechnya when they gained their independence in 1996, and then Shamil Basayev. The difference between the two men was that Basayev was basically a jihadist, so much so that he was called the Russian equivalent of Osama bin Laden, and Maskhadov was not a jihadist, although his rebels were more secular in comparison to Bazayev's. Also, Maskhadov was interested more in politics than he was in religion.
Yeah.
In terms of, just quickly, in terms of what happened to both of them, Maskhadov was killed in 2005 by the FSB in a raid, and Shamil Basayev was killed when a mine was mishandled in his presence and it blew up in his face.
In 2009, Russia basically declares the decade-long operation to be over, and President Medvedev so life in the pub was normalized. This is the policy of normalization, where the Russians actually try to rebuild Chechnya over the last 10 years. A lot of Chechens, when you look this up, say that Chechnya was completely transformed in this period and it's almost unrecognizable. But the scars of the war still remain. Russians are heavily persecuted and discriminated against by Chechens. I think this is a fallback to the Soviet period where actually Chechens were scored for speaking Chechen in the streets, and they were beaten up by Russians. Now that is flipped, and if you speak Russian on the street, you tend to be shouted at or beaten up. Even more, they do this even more so, more passion than to homosexuals. They really dislike people speaking Russian in Chechnya. In the last 10 years, basically things have calmed down, but there's still occasional terrorist attack. Like in 2015, five Chechens were arrested in the murder of the Russian politician Boris Nemtsov in Moscow, and also the Islamic State has gained the allegiance of certain Chechen separatist groups. Not in Chechnya, but Dagestan. It's like a cross-border affair between them.
It's also worth noting that Russians have a deep, burning hatred towards the Chechens as a result of the wars, but mainly the Second Chechen War. There were 3 terrorist attacks which caused the Russians to fiercely hate the Chechens. Bujanovsk, which was a terrorist attack that occurred in the First Chechen War, in which Basayev took 1,800 hostages in a maternity hospital and killed a whole bunch of them. The second was Moscow Theatre, and the third was Bezlin, which was a school in which 300 people were killed. These 3 attacks caused Russians to fiercely hate the Chechen people. In terms of actual poll numbers, 58% of Russians at the time, in 2004, supported stricter counter-terrorism laws and the death penalty for terrorism, while 33% of Russians supported banning all Chechens from entering cities. Also, attacks against Chechens skyrocketed after Bezlin and all 3 of these attacks in general.
Yeah. I would say the Chechen economy, which no one really knows about, the reason why the Russians were so well, for let's say passionate of taking Chechnya back after the declared independence in 1991 was because that Chechnya has oil. In fact, it's one of the most productive regions in terms of oil production in Russia. It's that the entire Caucasus is full of oil, and this is why for Russia it's so strategically important to keep control of the region. I think the Chechens got called all the Chechen knot, and the oil is the reason why the Chechnya is recovered so quickly. And it's why Russia would probably never give it up.
In terms of the number of people that were killed in the conflicts, roughly between 40,000 to 100,000 were killed in the First Chechen War, and in the Second Chechen War, that number was round about 150,000 to 250,000 at the highest estimates. Lowest estimates put it at 80,000 killed as a result.
Yeah.
And as Cameron mentioned, why did Russia bother fighting so fiercely for this region for the past 200 or so years, especially in the 90s and the early 2000s? Oil. Chechnya is oil rich in and of itself, and it's next to the Caspian Sea, which is also very oil rich.
Is it compared to the rest of Russia? There's a lot more state control. Like the media in Chechnya is run by almost entirely the Chechen government.
Mm.
It has no free media, opposition media. It's completely controlled by the state. Chechnya is basically autonomous republic within Russia, so it governs most of its own affairs, except the brief period during the Chechen wars where it had direct rule from Moscow.
James says, so what are your predictions for the future of the place? I don't particularly know. It all depends upon whether Kadyrov remains in control of the country or not. So long as Kadyrov is in charge, the place will remain stable, more or less, but it will remain very oppressive, very totalitarian, and very unpleasant to live in. In fact, it's going to remain that way for the foreseeable future, if we're going to be honest, because the insurgents will never give up. And it doesn't help the fact that they're being strengthened, funded, and armed by ISIS. And the mob, even if you got rid of the insurgents, would still remain a presence in the country because their kidnappings and their ransoms and their extortion turns a huge profit in the country.
It's not
so ultimately, Chechnya will only remain stable if it is ruled by a strong man. If it is not ruled by a strong man, it will likely descend into a sort of civil war of sorts.
Unless it becomes independent from Russia, it will be basically chaotic and the brink of another war. In the future, I think that we're going to see as the Islamic State slowly gets beaten in Syria and Iraq. You're going to see they have a greater presence in Chechnya, and there's going to be more dangerous.
Another thing worth taking into account as well is Chechnya is Putin as well. The reason why the country has remained under tight control and has not tried to do what it did back in the 90s and early 2000s is because of the strongman leadership of Vladimir Putin. The whole of Russia as it is right now is not particularly a stable country. It's only really being kept whole because of Vladimir Putin's regime. When Vladimir Putin eventually leaves office for good, whether that be because he dies or simply just stands down and doesn't stand again, Russia is likely going to tear itself apart because you have the military that shadows Putin and is effectively a junta, if we're going to be honest. The oligarchy that wants to turn it into a free market paradise, and separatist movements in other parts of the country that want to break away from Russia, such as Chechnya, and want to be their own independent states. Russia, post Vladimir Putin, is going to be a massive shit show.
It will likely be. And the future of Chechnya also depends on its neighbours, particularly Dagestan, which is another problematic republic. In terms of solutions to the issue, I really can't see it in a workable solution other than just giving the person full independence and trying to establish some sort of democratic republic unless it goes for its own devices. Other than that, I really can't see any way to solve this in the long term.
But even with that, when they were given their own sort of independence, and yes, I know they weren't fully independent because they were de jure part of Russia, but when they were independent from 96 to 99, it was a shit show. The government had no real control over the country whatsoever. There were no jobs. There was no real police force or military, and crime run rampant, and murders were very frequent.
Yeah, I think this goes back to the state of the South Caucasus before Russians intervened. And in the region of Chechnya, the Chechen national identity did not exist. A Chechnyan did not exist. People identify the village they lived in. The Chechen language didn't even exist. And so I think the mindset of a lot of Chechnyans, they don't see the nation state as a credible for government. In the South Caucasus, the idea of self-rule and independence was the key values from that region. It was completely isolated. Even the South Caucasus is isolated. I mean, Georgia culturally and linguistically is probably one of the most isolated nations on earth. Until the Ottomans and the Russians got involved in the country.
The other thing worth taking into account when the country was independent, when it had its first president during the Second Chechen War, which was Akhmat Kadyrov, which was Ramzan Kadyrov's father, he was actually on the side of the separatists in the First Chechen War, and he declared the struggle against Russia to be a jihad. But because of how much of a shit show independence was, he went against the idea of Chechnya being an independent state and was in favor of joining with Russia. It was also, this reason was basically the reason why he ended up becoming the first president of Chechnya before he was killed in a stadium bombing in 2005.
Yeah. Basically, Chechnya is a place that it's very difficult to gauge what's going on there socially. From all studies I looked at, people live there are generally very fundamentalist Islam. Like, the population is not very secular. Even if they tried to actually at one point establish a second republic, entire Chechen culture today is almost in one with radical Islam. You know, the term jihad to Chechens is like freedom to the Scottish nationalists from Braveheart. And from what I see, Islam is only prevalent there because of Russia. Islam is a thing to set themselves, to create their own identity opposed to Russians. Actually, before the 19th century, Islam was a minority religion.
The difference between this conflict and Nagorno-Karabakh is, with Nagorno-Karabakh, it may be very difficult, but provided you can get decent leaders in Armenia and Azerbaijan, there may be a solution to that conflict. With Chechnya, on the other hand, there is no solution. Even if it became an independent state, it would still be a shit show, just like it was from 96 to 99. Also, in addition to that, it cannot be a secular state because, as you mentioned, the population there is majority Muslim fundamentalist, and it is like that because of Russia's numerous military incursions into the country.
Yeah. But ironically, they did try to create a Chechen constitution that was secular, which was weird. It would never work. Also, I think I should say an article about what also Chechens are doing outside of Chechnya, because this conflict is not just limited to Chechnya. It's involved in particularly Ukraine and the Syrian civil war. So I got one article here. See, we like partisan warfare. Chechens fighting on both sides. On one side, fighters eager to enact revenge on Russia's plunder of their country. Fight for Kiev. On the other hand, forces loyal to Kadyrov Kremlin-backed regime support pro-Russian rebels. And I think the divide in Chechnya is just prevalent in Ukraine in terms of the volunteer forces. But I can't even going through this article. In the long drought struggle for Ukraine, it may surprise you to know that Chechen fighters in the hundreds have joined the battle. It's even more surprising to learn that having fighting on both sides. The legacy of two wars in Russia in the 1990s means there's no shortage of people from the Caucasus Republic eager to take up arms against the enemy again. But Chechen forces, loyal to the stronghold, those in Kadyrov, are also fighting alongside Russian forces in eastern Ukraine. I can't be angry with Russia my whole life, but I've been bucking of 36, the kind the Death Battalion, which is mainly made up of Chechens. There are Russians who helped us also during the Chechen Wars. It was like in Donetsk now. There's a bunch of people and groups fighting. He told a Guardian interview in Grozny at the peak of the fighting earlier this year, around 300 Chechens were fighting Donetsk on the side of the rebels. Boltonov said the fighters were volunteers and they coordinated their actions with the Donetsk rebel leadership. Chechens took part in a long and bloody battle for Donetsk airport, spending 5 months in and around Donetsk before returning to Chechnya. He said they were prepared to return to Donetsk whenever required. There's also around 100 Chechens fighting on the side of Ukraine in two volunteer battalions. One named after 1990 is independence leader Dudayev, and one named after Mansur, an 18th century Chechen leader who fought the Russians. The eventual solution to the Russian-Chechen problem, placing Kadyrov in charge, shouting with cash to renovate the republic, letting rule with impunity, is seen as the Kremlin's success, even as a blueprint and potential solution for East Ukraine. Russia's Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov also told his Ukraine counterpart, Pavel Kimrin, several times that Kiev should take Chechnya as a model, Kimrin told the Guardian. But for now, the legacy of Chechnya is being played out on the battlefields, not in statecraft. While Chechens on both sides have integrated into the bigger fight, there's also a element of inter-Chechen conflict on the battles of eastern Ukraine. While in Donetsk, Bolotkamov and his men released a video saying that coming to Donetsk to find Izzy Muniv, a 99 Chechen commander who lived as a refugee in Denmark and then arrived in Ukraine to found the Duluth battalion. Bolotkamov and his men wanted to liquidate him using derogatory language against Kadyrov. They saw in the video Udinov was indeed killed the Battle of Bratislav in February by a shell during retreat from a fourth position. When asked, the Chechen platoon was responsible for the deaths. Holocaust Mel said, "Allah took him." I think it ended that article there because I think you got the gist of what it's trying to suggest. Chechen conflict is being fought by proxy outside Chechnya. As things come out, nations are still present, and I believe just by looking at this article, the conflict could have eradicated easier under the right conditions. There's also one other article. Russia shows a rare soft spot to rescue Russia's ISIS children, and this is a reference to what's going on in Chechnya. Where these Russian names, but I read one quote from here. I thank God every day that we're here. Gabby Weaver, 37, said by phone from Grozny, the capital of Russian most remote Republic of Chechnya, where she said her children receive 40,000 rubles, which is approximately $822 a month in state welfare payments. While Vladimir Putin is renowned for his views to push terrorists, what's vowing to worst in the outhouse, Russia is more than willing than many Western nations that help women and children linked to Islamic State in Iraq, ISIS fighters, to return home from the Middle East. He explained the motivation by saying that children didn't choose to go to the conflict zone and we have no right to leave them there. And nearly 100 families of extremists in Syria and Iraq were repatriated in late 2017 for Russian intelligence services raised concerns in a country that's reputed the target of terrorist cells. Russia's experience illustrates challenges facing the US and Europe, how they decided to deal with citizens catching in Syria and Iraq who were part of ISIS. Governments have been reluctant to take back former fighters, people attacks and efforts to radical cellmates, but many extremists were killed, and thousands of wives and children were in prisons and camps following across the ISIS so-called caliphate, presenting humanitarian challenge and potential future security threat if fate is resolved. But I think the basis of this one is that the Russian state is trying to make an active effort, more so than many Western countries probably run, to actually accommodate and actually assist these families without them being radicalized. And there's a lot of fear that's being raised here, in particular in Europe, places like Sweden, where ISIS fighters will flee the Islamic State, and sometimes they'll bring the families with them and radicalize them. And this method is a way to actually calm it down, which is a very interesting effort to calm this problem down. And there's one more article that I want to go up before wrapping up the stream. And this is on the attacks on homosexuals within Chechnya, which I think this is a recent article from January, where in Chechnya, 2 dead and dozens held in LGBT purge as activists. Accounts echo from those 2017 when hundreds of men were rounded up and beaten. I mean, 2 people have been killed and nearly 40 descended in a crackdown in LGBT and Chechnya region. Activists said that the deaths were reported caused by use and torture by the police. Reports on Monday echo those from 2017 when hundreds of gay men were rounded up by the police, attributed to beatings and electric shocks in secret prisons, provoking international condemnation and sanctions. And if confirmed, the new detentions and killings will show a pressure on Russia and the Chechen leader Ramzan Kadyrov has not dissuaded him from presiding over modern day pogroms against LGBT people in the Kyrgyzstan Republic. So this is an example of what's been going on recently in Chechnya, and from what I've seen, this a lot of gay Chechens are fled to Moscow away from this. Also, you should know about Russia being an incredibly socially conservative country where actions against homosexuals are very common. In fact, they're just fleeing to Moscow where actually violence and actions against gay people is a common norm. So it actually suggests them how tragic the situation in Chechnya is. And it is a human rights problem. So anyway, Tom, do you have any more thoughts on this?
Not too much, no. I think we've covered everything.
Yeah, right. You know what? I'm gonna read the side chat and see everyone's comments. Yeah, I think we basically covered the breadth of the issue. There is more historical content you can go into, but I think this is enough for today. So I think I'm going to say thank you for everyone watching inside chat.
Before we end it quickly, I'm going to link some videos in the chat, side chat. If you want to learn more about this conflict, I'd watch these videos. Hang on. Two of them are from Feature History, who is an excellent history channel on YouTube. Recommend you subscribe to him and watch his videos. And the other video is from the Caspian Report, which I linked about the Nagorno-Karabakh situation. Caspian Report is very good at explaining the situations and the conflicts in the Caucasus and Eurasia more broadly.
And there's one more thing as well. I'll probably do another stream like this, and I'll do another Twitter poll on the potential subjects that we can do. Also, I netted Dagestan a couple of times, which is right next to Chechnya. Now, I think, even though it might be very similar, I think I'm maybe an option to go into. Because, like I said, it's like Chechnya, but it has a lot more minorities, and it's less renowned. But anyway, I think that's it for today. So again, I say thank you for everyone watching, and I'll put our Twitter poll on the next subject in the next few weeks. Thank you.
Thank you for tuning in, peeps. Have a good evening.